morning, everyone, and welcome to this first policy debate of the day. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce our speakers, Mikhail Mikhailovich Kasyanov, former Prime Minister of Russia from 2000 to 2004. Previously, Mr. Kasyanov also served as First Deputy Prime Minister in 2000 and Minister of Finance in 1999. During the 90s, he also worked in the administration of President Boris Yeltsin. And since leaving Russian government for disagreements with leadership, Mr. Kasyanov today is one of the leading critics of President Putin and an opposition leader. Welcome. And Anders Aslund, professor at Georgetown University and a leading specialist on economic policy of Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. He was also a resident senior fellow in the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and he advised many governments on economic policy, notably the government of Russia in the 90s and the government of Ukraine. It is once again a great honor and privilege having such great minds to talk about Russia. The topic indeed is Russia doomed? First-hand perspective for post-war scenarios. And I think we can all agree that we cannot discuss Russia about having in mind the brutal war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. But once the war comes to an end, the general agreement is also that nothing can go back to business as usual. It cannot go back inside Russia to business as usual, nor in the global arena. So the end goal of this discussion for my speakers is to answer what is next for Russia. Is it a democracy? Will it get worse before getting better? Or is Russia doomed to remain an autocratic and kleptocratic regime? So Winston Churchill once described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery and inside in an enigma. Mr. Kasyanov, you have personal experience working with Vladimir Putin. You were his prime minister during the first years of his presidency. Can you tell us what led Putin, what mix of ingredients went into the decision-making of invading Ukraine?
Oh, I would say, Anna, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to appreciate and express my thanks just to be here with you and President Zorinda and his team, just excellent just for inviting me. Just answering to your question, we should understand that now we have just completely different Putin. Putin in 2000, when we got just elections, I think that time he, for the first time, won elections with the result 51%. All other elections were just like manipulation and fake. But in that time, just he supported all reforms just my cabinet initiated. And at that time, we have had excellent relations with the European Union. The whole, I would say, cabinet of Russia met with the Commission, and we just had very good relations. And we, in 2003, announced our strategic partners, building up just free market from Lisbon to Vladivostok and visa-free zone. But later, Putin started to change in 2005, 2006, etc. You remember his speech in Munich? And just he already said at that time, we're surrounded by enemies. The reason, I think, the reason was, in my time, he pretended to be democratically devoted leader. But in reality, he was always a KGB agent. And now just he started, since 2005, 6, and 7, change and be a real. Right now, what is happening? Putin just driven by impunity, first. And secondly, he understood that manipulating by population, that's possible, absolutely, poisoning generations and keeping and feeding people with lies. And right now, just half of population believes that Putin is right, that Americans, the ugly Americans, are responsible for everything what's going on around, including, of course, this bloody war in Ukraine. And Putin believes that he should be, as a Soviet period time, just two leaders, American president and Russian leader, should decide the destiny of the whole world. And that's because of invasion in Georgia, because of annexation of Crimea, and war now, he continued to believe that impunity will exist.
Thank you very much. Just a quick follow-up on what you said about manipulating also the minds and poisoning a generation, which I very much agree. Would you say that the 90s was seen as a very chaotic years in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and then in a way Putin was seen as a leader of stability? Is it true that the Russian population, the Russian society still would prefer, the stability of Putin over the chaos of what they think of the 90s?
I would say there are different views on that. As I said, half of population lived in poverty, and they continue to live this. And they didn't feel the changes, positive changes on the end of 90s and the beginning of this century. And that's what the Putin's base for right now. But those people who living in the big cities, middle class people, of course they're suffering because of everything, because just they were oppressed. And just all those demonstrations, just trying and demanding Putin just to respect people just in elections, when he just stolen the important democratic institution, free elections. He just destroyed this. And right now in Russia, there is no any single feature of democracy. Russia never was a democracy, but we built up a democratic state. But Putin destroyed all those foundations which was managed to build up. And other part of population, as I said, people living in big cities, they, of course, suffering. Some of them, almost 1 million people already left Russia because of this war. And others just closing their eyes, because just for them it's very difficult to admit that their country killing civilians just thousands and thousands every day. And they choosing just the way just not to admit this, just close the eyes and keep just somehow to survive. Everyone would like just the war to end as soon as possible, but majority of Russians, of course, don't want to be defeated. And that's why just they have some kind of, I would say, confusion on that. They understand what's going around, they don't want to admit, but they need peace and don't want to be responsible for that. That is the problem of the society. It's ill society right now. Putin already, as I said, poisoned just.
We'll come back to the post-war scenarios in a little bit later, but Mr. Aslund, I'd like to talk a little bit about the economy of Russia. You were advising the Russian government in the beginning of the 90s, which is, of course, followed the fall of the Soviet Union, and we know that those years have been chaotic, but it also led to an emergence of this very rich elite, which we know as the oligarchs. However, when Putin came to power, he, in a way, declared war on the oligarchs of the 90s, which led to imprisonment of some of them. One of the most notable cases is Mikhail. But then he still proceeded to create a new elite because he redistributed a lot of wealth and concentrated a lot of state assets and wealth to a close circle of friends, creating de facto the kleptocratic regime that we see today. How did that impact Russian economy and Russian politics? And was there ever a window for Russia was Russia ever on the path of economic reforms, or was that window just shut down?
Oh, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to the Martin Center, and particularly to Prime Minister Zorinda. On the question, Russia was never as free as in 1992. Think of that. Russia was then a perfectly free country. Moscow had something like 30 different newspapers with every shade of opinion. Intellectually, it was a wonderful time. Economically, it was an awful time. And when did the reformers lose out? On the 22nd of November, 91, when the reformers lost the appointment of the head of a central bank. The reformers never had control over the central bank. And therefore, they were blamed for hyperinflation, which did take hold in 92, but they could not stop it. What the reformers could do were two things. First, liberalize prices and markets in January 92, and then gradually pursue a privatization. But what happens with privatization if you have very high inflation and not very free market? Well, you get a concentration of money to a few people. That's what happens if you have a poorly functioning market. So this was an accident because the reformers did not have enough powers. How could it have been done differently? President Yeltsin should, in October or November 91, have dissolved the Russian parliament and held elections. He had the flawed ideas that he could rule with decree. You can't rule a democracy in decree. So by the 1st of April 92, the reformers effectively lost power also over government policy. And that was not the end of it. We hoped that something could be turned around, but that it didn't happen. President Yeltsin was very good if it was a real crisis, but it had to be a very severe crisis for him to wake up and act hard. Otherwise, he was often quite absent. But of course, reforms did take place. Prime Minister Kasyanov was outstanding in balancing between the two forces, the oligarchs on the one hand, and the Putin KGB officers on the other hand. So during his period, I would say 2000 to 2003, that was the most successful reform period in Russia. Putin had very little impact on that. It was the technocrats who could do their job because the KGB people were fighting the oligarchs. And Putin effectively arrived at a late table because after all, the growth started with 6.5% in 99 before he became president. And then he could surf on good reforms that had been laid in the 1990s in a very arduous fashion, but still the foundation was there. And after that, he started, as you said, accumulating the money for himself and his friends. By 2007, he went for nationalization. Since 2009, Russia has hardly had any growth, and from 2014, none whatsoever. Putin does not care about economic growth. He cares about two things: power and money for himself and his friends, not for the people. And unfortunately, people look upon what happens when somebody's in power. Well, Russia had 10 years of growth of 7% a year until 2008. And they think that Putin was the person who was responsible for that. I would say that the man here to my right had much greater responsibility for it than Putin had. And I would also credit President Yeltsin and Prime Minister Gaidar for having accomplished that. Putin was a lucky man arriving at the late table. And apart from the KGB background that Mikhail Kasyanov emphasized, I would also emphasize the criminal background. Putin was very much a person who arbitrated among the organized crime groups in the most criminal city in Russia in the early 1990s, St. Petersburg. And he comes straight out of organized crime and the KGB. What can you expect, what we have today?
Thank you very much, Mikhail Mikhailovich. Is power in Russia more important than money? I think that this combination of, oligarchs and the Kremlin is a very interesting, has a very interesting relationship. What is that? Do the oligarchs pose a threat to whoever sits in the Kremlin? Was Putin threatened by the oligarchs of the 90s? How does that relationship work?
At the end of the 90s, rich people, oligarchs at that time, of course, they were influential. They had their voice and could influence on the decision-making process. And Putin decided just to eliminate this. And just he threatened all of them. And you correctly mentioned just Mikhail Khodorkovsky was put in jail as an example, so to demonstrate to others what could happen with any of them. And that worked. And since that time, just right after my departure in 2005, just when Yukos was sold for nothing for his friends, Putin's friends, just redistribution of property started. And since that time, just Putin's friends, it's new oligarchs. Old oligarchs of 90s disappeared. They rich people, but not oligarchs, because they can no influence on authority. But Putin's friends, new oligarchs, new billionaires, that were just ruling the country. They had up to 50% of Russian economy under their control. Putin controls every flow of money. Putin controls just every production of any product through his friends. And that's why right now there is a combination of this factor. Putin created the country capitalism for friends. And he, before cared about money, right now he cares about money, about power, keeping himself in this position. And very soon, in March, we will see just a reappointment, reinauguration by himself for another term. And now just important for him, just everything what's going on in the battlefield and the war against Ukraine. And that's what he is right now, a little bit, I would say, a good internal situation, seeing that counteroffensive operation doesn't create so much result as people expected. And he is going to announce very soon that he is running for next term and that he won the first stage of the battle against the whole West taking place on the territory of Ukraine. That's how he positioned through propaganda this war right now.
Yeah, and also, of course, we know that Vladimir Putin and people in the Kremlin are masters of propaganda, and they certainly know what they're doing when it comes to that. But let's talk for a moment about the democratic opposition in Russia. You are one of the opposition leaders. There are also a few others. Some of them are friends of the Martin Center that we know quite well. However, there is a feeling sometimes in the West that the democratic Russian opposition does not speak with a united voice, that most of them are outside of Russia, therefore they're not reaching out to Russian society, they're unable to somehow pass that message, and that not a lot is being done by the opposition to bring change from within. So my question to you is there a united democratic opposition in Russia, and is it doing enough to somehow influence what is going on in Russia right now?
No, first of all, just now, my country undertakes the brutal criminal war against the neighbor country. And in this period, Russian democratic opposition, as you correctly said, just part of us outside. Some people, activists still in Russia, behaving in more, I would say, quiet situations, so that not identify themselves just as open criticism, because they immediately can be put in jail for 10 or 20 years, as some of my political friends are already in jail. And we are united in terms of understanding what's going on. There is no single person in democratic opposition who somehow support Putin, or saying just not everything just the same. Everyone, all of us, saying just this is a criminal war. We're completely against this. We're in the full support of Ukraine for their fight for their sovereignty and territorial integrity. There's no disagreement on that. Disagreements could be discussions about future of Russia. That's, of course, long-standing discussion and would last for a long period of time. Some people just saying, some of us on a radical position saying just Russia would be I would say, will not exist as at the same state as today. Others say just Russia would stay forever, but that is another discussion. Of course, my position is always that Russia deserves to be a democratic state, and there is a possibility for Russians, first of all, to clean up their mind after Putin's propaganda. We need time for that. And then afterwards, they will make their choice to build up a democratic state. But it takes time, and we need special efforts by all democratic forces to ensure people to realize the truth and to realize what Russia did and to take responsibility. Not all Russians not guilty, only those who participated in the war, but all Russians are responsible for that. We did, some people say, not enough when we tried to change the regime, just building ourselves just opposition on the elections, which was semi-quasi-elections, but we were destroyed. Right now, just the atmosphere of fear exists in Russia. Some of leaders in my party, Parnas People's Freedom Party, Boris Nemtsov, more co-leader with me, just was killed. My deputy Volodya Kara-Murza in jail for 25 years. My deputy Ilya Yashin in jail for 8 years. Some other our activists, 5 people now in jail waiting for their sentence, final decision of courts. Some of us just outside. Navalny just simply under torture, permanent torture. That's what the atmosphere inside. That's what we're dreaming for future. And the trigger would be, of course, victory of Ukraine against Putin and his team and Putin's Russia. What this victory means? For me, that is absolutely to restore the full territorial integrity with the borders of 1991. That will be the victory of Ukraine. And then in Russia, changes will start immediately right after that.
Thank you very much. I particularly liked what you said about not all Russians are guilty, but all Russians are responsible. And I think that's just one of the takeaways that we will take from this conversation. And Mr. Aslund, let us talk about possible war end scenarios. We all know that at some point the war will have to end. We don't know when and we don't know how. So what are some of the scenarios that you see likely happening, but also what would it mean for Russia? Does a post-war Russia necessarily mean a post-Putin Russia? Are we talking about, there are rumors about dissolution? Will Russian Federation not exist anymore? Will we have a Prigozhin scenario, an internal coup d'etat? Will there be a democratic transition? How do you see the sort of post-war playing out for Russia?
Thank you. Let me first continue a little bit about this on the Russian opposition. I fully agree with what Mikhail Kasyanov said, but I would like to draw out a few things here. The Russian opposition abroad now has consolidated. What you said here, it's very much what you can hear from very many representatives of the opposition. The second is Putin has to go, and his regime has to go. There has to be democratic elections afterwards. So this has people previously said, we don't want destabilization of Russia. They have now turned quiet. We do want destabilization of Russia. And then also what Mikhail Kasyanov said about Ukraine. Everybody now understands in Russia that Ukraine is a nation. Ukraine must stay an independent country within, as Mikhail Kasyanov said, within the borders of 1991. And that means Crimea has to go back to Ukraine. So therefore, we have got a very nice consensus. Where the differences lie now, how do we reach this? There we don't see a few people want to go over to armed struggle. They are so far very few, and there are also suspicions about who are they really. Is this a provocation? So I leave that aside, but that's a minor topic. On your question, I see essentially two scenarios. First is Putin will go, and then is the question what comes afterwards. One alternative is my favorite scenario is August 91. Some idiots come to power and don't know what, and instead start drinking and get lost. And then the power falls into to the street, and then we'll see who picks it up. My bet is Alexei Navalny, if he's still allowed to come out and alive. The other alternative is some kind of chaos that can last for some years, as happened after Stalin, some liberalization, but no clear process for several years. But I don't believe much in it. I think that this regime will really collapse. I don't believe at all in a Prigozhin scenario. The worst person on the stage is Vladimir Putin. And the people who appear on Russian television and say all kinds of terrible things, wanting to nuke one country after the others, these are just creatures of Putin. They have no independent platform or constituency at all. So anything will be better after Putin. And how will Putin fall? Well, I don't think that he will survive victory by Ukraine in Ukraine. So I would even say when Ukraine takes Crimea or makes it impossible for the Russians to stay in Crimea, then Putin is lost. And how he will be lost, I think that the Kremlin can take care of.
Mr. Kasyanov, do you agree with that? That whatever the outcome of the war, it will mean the end of Putin?
Partially agree, but I think just first, of course, I agree. Just any other successor, whatever way successor comes to the power, would be better than Putin. That even example of 1953, when Stalin died, and during even funeral process, people already just in the leadership of Politburo already discussed, let's stop the war in Korea. And next day, they already approached the United States and saying, let's start negotiations of improving relations. And 4 months after, the war in Korea stopped. And Russian troops were withdrawn, and just the 42 parallel border just started to exist again, as Americans discussed with the Koreans. That could be a scenario. And that's what I'm saying, just any other person would be better, and anyone would look for negotiations. Democracy will not come to Russia immediately, and all those discussions of my friends that tomorrow will be free elections and we come to the power and change everything and create great Russia or better Russia, that's absolutely just illusion. We will come to turmoil, and the West and us should just take this risk. That it's absolutely useless discussions when they say just we shouldn't humiliate Putin because we'll be in both and both, etc., etc. That's wrong perception. We should take a risk of turmoil in Russia. And the nuclear threat is also, we should take a risk of this. Putin will not press a button because he understands, and he already given the explanation, that the whole army infrastructure and Putin's inner circle would be immediately destroyed, but not the nuclear response of conventional means, but it would be something. Putin knows this, and he using just nuclear weapon in the battlefield would not achieve victory against Ukraine. He understands this too. That's why just he already switched everything on the war at attrition. He believes that fatigue will come soon on Western capitals, and they will be not in a position to allocate billions and billions and billions every month. And the economy of Ukraine would be destroyed, and Russia can continue to exist. And right now we have just, in fact, the economic situation is not so bad as we expected. Not at last year when just the sanctions were announced and all analysts all over the world say just Russia would lose 10% of GDP. It didn't happen last year because just sanctions, the oil price cap for oil came only in December. But before it was huge prices for oil. And Putin got huge foreign exchange inflow into the country and managed not to implement just the budget approved, but to additionally to finance the militaries and the whole industry and produce more and more weapons. Today, in the first half of this year, Putin lost 50% of oil revenue because of cap. But right now, there is a bypassing situation, and just Russian oil already costs 75, not 45 as it was 6 months ago. Again, inflow coming in. And Putin will be able to finance the whole military, the whole system for the next year. He already increased by 60% just military expenditure for next year. It tripled with the period compared with what happened before the war. That's why we have these problems. That's why I'm saying just the success of Ukrainian operation, that's crucial for all changes. It means now we hope that late deliveries of these weapons to Ukraine will take place now just on time, and just offensive equipment will appear in the hands of Ukrainians, and they will be capable to do this successfully next year.
I think we can all agree on that point, but let's talk a bit about the Western approach to Russia. As I stated at the beginning, quoting Churchill, Russia has been, seen as this big enigma, an enigmatic, unpredictable actor. But I recently came across an op-ed you, Mr. Aslund, wrote that you argue that Putin has been in reality very transparent in his actions, but Western leaders did not understand him. So, does the West now have a strategy towards Russia? Was there ever a Russia strategy, a united Russian strategy of the West? And what should that strategy be for a post-Putin Russia?
Well, first, I would say that the West is probably more united on Russia now than ever before. We had for a long time that Germany insisted on importing gas from Russia. That is now over. And the only window we have for Putin is really Viktor Orban's Hungary. And then I live in Washington, and we have one problem there. It's these people who are worried about a destabilization of Russia because of control over the nuclear arms. They prefer that Putin, who threatens with nuclear war all the time, has control over the nuclear arms, than that there is unrest in Russia. It's the same thing as then President George Bush in August '91 spoke in the Ukrainian parliament against the Ukrainian independence because he was afraid of Russia, the Kremlin losing control over the nuclear arms. We have the same idea now, and this is what I'm concerned about in Washington. Russia and Putin have to be defeated, and we can still hear that Western spokespeople say we have to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. In order to accomplish what? Russia has to be defeated, Putin has to be defeated, and the real goal, which of course Western politicians should not say, is that Putin should be ousted. But that should be the real goal. But as I said before, the Kremlin should take care of that. We should not get into those details. But concretely on the sanctions, I think that we are in a relatively good place now with the sanctions. The financial sanctions have reduced Russia's foreign indebtedness by half since 2014. This is not radical, but it means that there is substantial financial constraint. And then these energy sanctions this year are likely to cut off 1/4 of Russia's export revenues. Because of the dominance of oil and gas. But it's completely correct what Mikhail Kasyanov said here. The energy sanctions have to be tightened. So this should be the main focus of the sanction discussion. Now, I'm a member of the Yermak-McFall International Working Group on sanctions on Russia, and we have recently, a month ago, put out a paper on how the energy sanctions should be tightened. So I think this is the big thing that should be done. And the other is that the Russian central banks has a bit more than $300 billion of cash that is in the West. 2/3 of that is in one country, Belgium, the Euroclear. And this money is, as the term runs, immobilized. That means frozen, it can't be moved. This money should be confiscated and passed on to Ukraine as war reparations. After Iraq attacked Kuwait, in 1990, Iraq was forced to pay $52 billion in war reparations. It didn't do so voluntarily, but it had fully paid up early last year. So that transaction is completed. And the World Bank assesses that the losses to Ukraine are already over $400 billion. All this money should be taken from Russia, and we can do so. And to insist that Russia, the Russian state, should have any kind of property rights after what they have done in Ukraine, and after they have confiscated Finnish Fortnum, German Uniper, Danish Carlsberg, and French Danone. Confiscated them as countermeasures for damage that has been caused to Russia. It should be self-evident that we should take this money, and this, the proper legislation should be adopted by the European Parliament so that the Belgians don't need to feel responsible for it themselves. And the US Congress is now considering such legislation, but there's very little Russian state money in the US because the Russians were afraid that the Americans would confiscate it. So I think that they were right. This money has to be taken. But on the current sanctions, tighten the energy sanctions, as Mikhail Kasyanov said. That's what's important now.
Thank you very much. And before I go back to Mikhail Mikhailovich, I'd like to ask Sandra to present us the answers of the Slido poll that we asked at the beginning.
Thank you, Anna. Indeed, you already halfway through your panel asked your distinguished guests about their opinion on Russia's future. We asked the same question our audience, and I need to say they were quite pessimistic, as 73% of our audience answered that the situation in Russia won't change and Putin will remain in power until he dies or appoints a successor. Another 27% voted that Putin will be toppled by palace coup without much change to the system he's built, and nobody thinks that the Russian opposition will topple Putin and install a democratic regime.
Well, thank you, Sandra, very much. That is indeed not a very optimistic view, or at least not the one that we wanted, the outcome that we wanted. Before I ask you the big question of what is next for Russia, I'd like to ask you, Mikhail Mikhailovich, what is your advice to the West, in dealing with Russia for a Russian policy or a policy towards Russia?
That is very simple. It's evident. To continue to support Ukraine in a full scale, just and as all Western leaders saying, just as much as long as necessary. Till what? Now just I try to formulate till Ukraine's victory. Ukraine's victory means liberation of whole territory up to the border of 1991. That's what be just more understandable what is supported, how long and what scale it should be. Secondly, just recommendation, just take risk of turmoil in Russia. Don't rely on Putin, that he keeps nuclear weapon under control. Any other successor would keep this under control. And of course, just to understand that Russia should go, as I say, a gray period, because just democracy would not come next year after Putin, will not come in 2 years after Putin, but could come in 5 years. And just believe that the only way to provide a proper security for European continent and for the whole world, that democratic Russia. That's why think about just democratic Russia and those people who devoted to democratic principles. Those Russian opposition and other ordinary people who believe Russia should be democracy. We given a chance, but we lost this chance. But we deserve to get another opportunity to do this. And just to say that Russians imperialists in their DNA, absolutely not the case. Take an example of other countries and European countries. Take Greece, take Spain, take Portugal, take Germany. Just they managed to overcome those problems and build up normal democracy. Russia will do the same. Now population poisoned. Of course, all this brutality that we see, of course it is. It is criminal activity. But it doesn't mean just all Russians by their DNA as such. We should be given the opportunity. This time will come. Not necessarily Russian opposition, as it was demonstrated, just would press Putin now. It will never happen this time. It happened later, when other people will appear instead of Putin. And then democratic forces will start to compete, will start oppressing those people, and they will not be capable to rule. Putin just around him destroyed everything. There is no any person for this autocracy could replace. No Putin, there is no authoritarian, and now just I could say totalitarian regime. It means no one could continue the same rule. Changes will be inevitable. And in a few years, just we will definitely get a chance to build up a democratic state, well, at least to step in on this route.
Thank you very much. You partially answered already my last question. And before I do ask the audience if there are some questions. You do have an optimistic view. You do think that there is democracy in Russia's future. Can I ask you what is your prediction as to how long? What is your best case scenario for a democratic Russia? Is it going to take 10 years, 20, 30, 50?
My best scenario is just Ukraine next year, summer, by October, by autumn, Ukraine achieve its victory. Putin goes out, or completely losing his legitimacy. He doesn't have just much legitimacy, but because of this propaganda, he feels that he has. And changes will start. Will be a difficult period, not understandable right now who will be in the power. In Russia, but in any case, my position, the position of my party, everything should be under constitutional umbrella. It's long period. It means through other elections of president. Who will be the candidate? That will show if Putin disappears on one or another reason next year. But I think next year that will be the beginning of changes. It will take 3-5 years to normalize relations, and of course to build up the way, to pave the way for the right direction of building up a democratic state.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Aslund, what is your view? Does Russia have a democratic future, or is it doomed to fail in a way?
Yeah, I definitely think that Russia has a democratic future. And with regard to imperialism, Professor Tim Snyder of Yale University has a very popular lecture course now on Ukrainian history. And his view of European history is very much that imperialism is popular until you are defeated. And when various European countries have been defeated, they have abandoned their imperialism. And then they want the European Union, all kinds of nice, peaceful things. And he argues that this will happen to Russia also. That when Russia is defeated by Ukraine, then it will be clear that the imperialist period is over in Russia's history. And could take my friend Leonid Gozman, another prominent Russian opposition politician who is now in Berlin. He had to leave all of a sudden so that he was not arrested for a longer period than 1 month in Moscow. He argues that the best that can happen to Russia is capitulation, as Germany and Japan in 1945. And I could add that a capitulation does not necessarily mean that anybody invades the country. It means that the military collapses, and that can happen in many ways. And I have one difference here with Mikhail Kasyanov. I think that when the process starts, it will happen very fast. Russia has collapsed repeatedly in the history. And I believe much more in August 91, and then that it will take several years of some kind of semi-old regime hanging on. I think that everybody will just run away and say, okay, now we have to save ourselves because we can't control the country any longer. And then one has to act very fast. And this is what was not sufficiently done in 91. In August 91, President Yeltsin cut up the KGB into 5 organizations and cut the staff by approximately half. He should have prohibited it. This should be a first step that FSB is prohibited as an organization, and other secret police organizations as well. And then dissolve the Duma and the Federation Council and hold democratic elections, and also for a president, as Mikhail Kasyanov said. But this has to be done fast. You can't wait. And a mistake in after 91, that was that Russia only held parliamentarian elections in December 93. And then Vladimir Zhirinovsky had popped up, and there were all kinds of terrible red-brown moods coming to the fore. They didn't exist in the fall of 91. So it was important to hold the elections earlier. And these are probably the 2 most important things that need to be done. Prohibit the FSB and hold early democratic elections.
Thank you very much. Well, it's good to see that the panel has a more optimistic view that the audience that answered the poll. I'd like to turn to our guests now to see if there are any questions in the audience. Are there mics? I see a hand in the back here, and so the lady in blue and the sir next to her.
Hi. Thank you very much for being here with us today and presenting your view. I have a question about Russians who are residing here in Europe already for a long time, who are not poisoned, who have access to the information, but who don't organize any protests in front of the Russian embassies, but more usually organize the protests in support of Putin and against weapon deliveries to Ukraine. So is the Russian opposition doing something about it to consolidate people? Thank you.
And we'll go to the sir, actually next to you. If you can pass the mic, we'll collect 2 questions and we'll go back.
Very much indeed. Yanis Vakmanis, Prime Minister Kasyanov. When you were Prime Minister, I was advisor to the President of Latvia at the same time. And I thank you for, I think, a very realistic view on the way things look, and also your strategy. I think that's the right strategy to increase pressure, continue pressure, and as Professor Aslund also said, the confiscation strategy seems also a good one. But my question is a different one. China. What effect is China and China's strategy having on the Kremlin, on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and on the Ljubljanka? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go back to the panel now. I'd like actually both of you to tackle the question of opposition. We have discussed also at length yesterday with Professor Aslund the opposition. You are part of the opposition. We also have a few, Vladimir Ulov, who is friend of the Martin Center, who is in the opposition. And I think the opposition is doing a lot to speak against Ukraine, but how do you answer to the question of?
You're absolutely correct. This opposition doing a lot to speak freely, just and to explain to Russians, those who can just get out in the internet, just this information. In terms of demonstration on the streets, I think we're doing this, not such a scale as Putin can arrange just with his financing, say in Germany, in Austria, and other just countries on the streets. But from time to time, we're having these demonstrations. In Latvia, for instance, just as there is a permanent picket across of embassy, Russian embassy in Riga. In Vilnius in Latvia, the same, and that's what, from time to time, we do this. On now just China.
Yeah, go ahead.
On China, On China, I think it's a very good question. In fact, right now, infiltration of China is growing. And it's already, I think, maybe 2 million Chinese already in territory in Russia. For Russia, for future Russia, that's a big, big problem, because Putin is, in fact, destroying Russian Federation at its potential, because just he's switching everything on China. China understands this very well, and they're playing a very aggressive role. For instance, right now there is a problem with natural gas. Putin doesn't know what to do with Russia with gas. We have only just one pipeline to Turkey and one pipeline to China, with a not comparable volume, just what we had to Europe. And Putin is looking for a second pipeline, Siberian. Chinese don't agree, but Chinese require more and more discount. That's already just going, not on the market price gas going there, but Chinese require more. Chinese require more projects in Siberia, on the forestry and others. That's why just they getting more and more. In Russian territory, from Urals to the Pacific, there's only 16 million people live. In China, just only 5 provinces bordering with Russia on this, 250 million people living there. And all these Chinese would like to live in a free territory there. And there is illegal infiltrations through corruption, and there is legal Chinese getting there and just foolish Russian girls and getting married with them, and then getting Russian passports, and just live there already on an official position. That's what the problem. That Putin just creating problems for future. He living for today and tomorrow by his power, how to keep his power, but not for future of this country. That's the problem. I think he himself realizes this, but he has no chance, because he locked. He has no plan B. That's what the problem. That's why I'm saying, just take a risk of so-called turmoil in Russia.
Thank you very much. And Professor Aslund, would you like to address both the question of the opposition? You also know a lot of Russian opposition leaders, if they're doing enough, what about demonstrations? And then also to tackle the question of China.
Well, rather more broadly on the Russian diaspora. The biggest Russian diaspora is probably in Germany. And I think that's about 3 million. They are formally called Germans, ethnically German, from coming to a considerable extent from Kazakhstan, who have emigrated to Germany. And I don't think that they're very happy with their situation and how they have succeeded with not very good education from faraway places. So I think that this is a considerable part of the explanation. But there are many explanations. There are people who want to show that there are something in various places of the world. On China, I would like to add there that it was said yesterday, quite importantly in the discussion on foreign policy, that China is a rising power and Russia is declining power. Therefore, Russia is aggressive and revanchist because it doesn't really see its own future. The economy is stagnant and just declining relative to others. While China is still rising, and we should be more worried when it's a declining power. Remember that World War I was started by one of the most declining powers, Austria-Hungary at the time, and not by the rising power that was Germany at the time.
Thank you very much. And since I see, okay, I'll allow one more question. Then I have also, as a moderator's privilege, there's a lady in the back.
Super quickly from the Prime Minister, would the opposition also withdraw from Georgia's occupied areas as well? And also, should we be afraid of Russian fragmentation in future? Or is there a process by which giving more powers to the regions could be managed in a controlled way?
Prime Minister Kasyanov,
okay.
Yes.
First on Georgia, of course, that's the occupation or control over Georgia should be withdrawn. It's absolutely the case, and I think just the West is responsible for that, because in 2008 There was a ceasefire plan, and which provide just the demand from Putin just to withdraw troops and to restore all territory. But 3 months after, just business as usual. And Putin said, that's the way how I, Putin, allow to behave. And that's why Crimea appeared later on. Of course, in Georgian case, it's very example just how we should not treat Putin when he just violating just international law. On potential dissolution, I think my feeling and my knowledge, just there is no intention on any part of Russia right now to withdraw from Russian territory, from Russia. Just the only two potential territories or autonomous republic right now, that's Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. They're capable, from the economic point of view, just they're capable to survive. But even there, they don't want to leave Russia. They would like their rights, real federative rights as autonomous territories, but not outside of Russia.
Thank you very much. And if you allow me, I will use my moderator's privilege to ask you one final question. And I would like a comment from both of you on Nagorno-Karabakh. So what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, both the government and Armenian people did blame Russia because it did not sustain its promise to be the grantor of security in the region. So what does it say about Russia's sort of power and dominance in the region that it did not step back? If it wasn't for the war in Ukraine, would Russia have intervened in that situation? And what does it say about Russia's power that it's allowing other countries like Turkey to be present now and be a player in that region? So maybe we'll start with Mr. Aslund and then we'll go to Mikhail Mikhailovich.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. And it really shows that Russia has nothing to do in the former Soviet republics now. And what Armenia has done in the last few days is that it has ratified the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. So Putin cannot in the future come to Armenia without being arrested. And the previous presidents of Armenia came from Nagorno-Karabakh. And Putin strongly supported them, Robert Kokharyan and Sergei Sargsyan. And Nikol Pashinyan is a nice Democrat, basically, a former journalist, and Putin doesn't like him a bit. So he was probably quite happy to see Pashinyan being challenged inside Armenia, but he did not succeed now. I think the broader consequence is that the two post-Soviet Russian organizations, the CS2, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, will disappear now. Armenia will withdraw, and Kazakhstan will probably withdraw, and then it's meaningless. And the other is the Eurasian Economic Union, which also will collapse. So Russia is done with its neighboring countries apart from Belarus.
Thank you. And Mr. Kasyanov, do you agree with that assessment? What does it mean for Russia?
On Nagorno-Karabakh, I will look at this from the little bit different angle. First, for 30 years, leaders of Armenia were generals from Nagorno-Karabakh who were just led this war there. But Russia always, as any other country, just recognized the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan and never recognized Nagorno-Karabakh as independent or just as part of Armenia or whatever. The problem was just to ensure and to let Armenian government to understand, to have an influence on Nagorno-Karabakh leadership so that they will fight for their autonomy, real autonomous status inside Azerbaijan. Because of good relations, as Dr. Aslund just said, between Russian leadership and just Armenian leadership at that time, they thought it would be forever. Right now, because of this great mistake, Armenian people suffering and just fleeing out of Nagorno-Karabakh. But right now, Russia already lost all influence there because just Pashinyan, being a democratic leader, of course, now looking for a security of the country. And he understands that Russia cannot provide this security. That's why there is right now just disappointment. And Kremlin, that they're losing just Armenia. They lost opportunity because of just closing on a short sighting of Putin and the leaders of Armenia at that time.
Thank you. And I just have a question from an online viewer coming in that I would like to use to close this discussion. And I would ask you to give me, a 20-second answer. It's a big question. Do you really think that democracy will occur in Russia while democracy collapses in Europe? Mr. Aslund.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a very short answer. That's a good one. And Mr. Kasyanov.
As I said, first, I'm sure that Europe would overcome those problems in a few countries. But as I said, described in our discussion, that I dream and I believe that there is a positive scenario for Russia. And not tomorrow, but the day after, democracy in Russia will exist. And we will build up with new generations that. I think that's the future for the whole world and for Russia in particular, being an integral part of it.
That's an excellent closing to our discussion. I would like to thank my speakers, Mikhail Kasyanov and Anders Aslund, and the audience. Thank you once again for sharing your insights and your experience, and has been truly fascinating. Thank you so much. And Sandra, I'd like to pass over to you.